Hello, my name is Paula Fontenelle. Thank you for being in my channel. Today I share with you a presentation that I made for Boston University to students of forensic psychology. In this presentation I talked about suicide prevention, many aspects related to suicide, but I actually start by questioning what is suicide. And this is a very, very important question because we do have a very narrow view of what suicide is, and this is something that I invite you to think about. And why is that crucial? Because in my experience, working on suicide prevention for more than a decade, is that there is no single answer to the question, what happened? There are many factors involved, and that's what I invite you to think about today. I hope you enjoy. First question everyone asks, and what that leads to is feeding the stigma. I do believe that because the moment you ask the question, what happened, you believe that suicide is an isolated event. That's something, there might have been a trigger for suicide, but it's way deeper than that. And that's what I hope to accomplish today with you. If I can broaden your view on what suicide is and what's behind suicide, then I think I will have accomplished my main goal. So I invite you to just breathe in. I know this is a very heavy subject. And before I start, I want you to know that I feel very comfortable talking about my father and what happened to him. And that's the story that I truly know. So feel free to ask about that. And I will be sharing with you some, for example, when I talk about warning signs, I'm going to talk about what I experienced with him. And of course, everything in retrospect, because back then I didn't know anything about suicide, and I had never had any experience with suicide. No one in my family before my father did that, or even friends, or maybe just the stigma hid it from me. I don't know, it's hard to know. But I just invite you to be open to the idea that suicide is not an isolated event. So the first thing that I want to show you is this map. This is the World Health Organization map on suicide. And of course, you know, the highest suicide rates are the red areas. But this is the first thing that I invite you to think about. When we look at numbers, and when we talk about numbers and suicide, and the World Health Organization talks about this too, we have to be very, very careful because there is a lot of underreporting and suicide. When I use numbers, I usually use numbers of the United States. I use Australia numbers, the UK too. They're very serious about suicide prevention because I know that most places, and I believe that what the World Health Organization says, it's 75% of the numbers we can't really trust. And I'll give you an example of Brazil, for example. If you look at in the US, the average population suicide rate is 14 per 100,000. That's how we measure. For every 100,000, 14 suicides. So when we look at Brazil, you see 6.5. And of course, the first reaction is, what are we doing right? Why is it lower than the US, right? No, we're not doing anything right. We're just underreporting. That's what's happening. It's not a real number. I'm sure it's way higher. And just to give you a brief example of that, this is something that was just released in Brazil. A mayor of a very small city, they have maybe 45,000 people. It's a very small town in Brazil, in the south of Brazil. He changed the rules for hospitals he just made the rules strict on reporting suicide attempts when patients came to hospitals. And in 1 year, he did that. The changes that he made was in 2016, the end of 2016. So the number of suicide attempts that were reported in hospitals in this little town of 45,000 people was almost 1,000% higher in 1 year. That's not completed suicide, that's attempted, but still it gives you a snapshot of how underreported it is. Because in hospitals, what we hear is a lot of accidents. So firearm accident, and they were just not being reported right. And I don't even know why this mayor did this. He just became interested in suicide prevention too, but it just gives you an idea of how underreported it is. So that's the first invitation that I make. When you read numbers, be sure to check which numbers, where they come from. Are they trustworthy or not? So the World Health Organization always talks about this, and it's very important to consider, because it does lead to just misleading numbers, really. You see the highest suicide rate and you look, wow, that's very high. Yeah, but it's still underreported. Even in the US, it's not perfect. It's not perfect anywhere. And there are many reasons for that. I'm not going to go into that, but the stigma is a big one. So just for you to consider. And this is a new slide that me and Danielle, when we talked about this and realizing what you are studying, you study forensic, you're in criminology, right? And forensic. Oh, by the way, I can see you, so you can just raise your hand, okay? You don't have to shout if you have a question. I thought it would be interesting to show you this, that when I talk about the stigma, it's so bad, and it has a huge impact on us survivors who go through the grief of suicide, that in some countries, and still quite a lot of countries, it's still outlawed. So it's a crime in many countries, suicide attempt. So I found this list of countries, and I can send it to Danielle if you're interested. It just shows you that in many places like Bahamas, India, Kenya, Lebanon, Pakistan, many places still, if you attempt suicide, you go to prison. So that's how bad it is. And I thought that for you, that this would be an interesting information, because it just shows how bad it is. It's either silenced, the stigma either creates silence within societies, but it's also criminalized. And in cases like I was looking at Bahamas, if you induce and if you help someone attempt suicide, you have life in prison. So I'll send this table to Danielle and she can share it with you, but I thought it would be interesting. So the first thing we're going to look at are the risk factors related to suicide. Prior attempt is the main one. You have a much higher chance of dying or risk of dying of suicide if you have attempted before. Family history, if you have, and this is an interesting one. And I actually experienced this in my own family, because it's a double-sided sword here, because it can be a risk factor. And how can it be a risk factor? Because in a way, if you have never come in contact, that's the case of my family, you've never had contact with suicide, you never thought about it, you never had any friends who thought about it. When someone in your own family dies of suicide, it's like they open the door and they give you an option. From that point on, for some family members, or it can be a friend too, it's a door that's open and it becomes an option in a way. So that's why it's risk factor. But the opposite can happen, and it happened in my family. My sister, my older sister, she had depression for many years, and she still does. She's still being treated for depression. And I remember when it happened to my father, She called me one day and she was crying. She had never started treatment for depression, but at the time she had a young daughter, my niece, I believe she was, let me see, yeah, she was 5 years old at the time. And she called me, my sister was crying one day and she said, I can never do this to her. I can never put my daughter through what I'm going through. So from that moment, that was the moment, it was a turning point for her, because that's when she started treatment. She said, I'm going to treat it because my father was diagnosed and never did treatment. And I'll talk about that later too. But for her, it was the opposite. She said, I can never do to my daughter what he did. I can't do this. I cannot take my own life. So for that, and for her, the way to stop that from happening was by doing treatment. And she's been in treatments until today. So it's something that we have to consider too. It is a risk factor, but it depends. It depends on the impact that it has on her. And I've seen it happen with many families that I've talked to throughout the years, of them saying exactly what my sister did. I can't do this to my sister or to my mom or to my dad. So it's something that we have to consider too. Childhood trauma too can be a risk factor. Mental health conditions, this is something that I think it's worth mentioning too, because it's been changing. It used to be that we used a 90%, when we talked about mental health and suicide, we used to say that 90% of the cases of suicide were related to mental illness that were either not diagnosed or not properly treated. This has changed a lot. In the US, just so you have an example with numbers that I trust, the latest numbers that we have showed that only 54% were related to mental illness. So that's going down. It's mainly, a lot of it is related today with personal crisis. So it is a risk factor for sure, especially depression, but it's not as we used to believe it is. So there are many other factors related to that. Personality traits, because that has an impact on how you deal and coping skills and all of that. Emotional regulation. Physical conditions for older people, that's more prevalent. Access to method, that's very important. And you see, for example, here in the US, the number one method is guns, and that's because guns is very prevalent here. So it does depend on the culture too. Hopelessness is a major one. Hopelessness, it's like the end. It's one of the things that we really pay attention to when it comes to prevention and assessing risk. Because because we all have personal crises, we all have all kinds of problems. But if we reach a place of hopelessness, that's when it's really a red flag, because we don't see any way out. And that's when suicide can become an option. Prolonged stress too. Gender is an important one to consider too. And I've seen this mistake being made many times, because when you look at the numbers, and that's worldwide, that it's one of the things that happen everywhere, is that most of the times men die by suicide. That's the highest. It's way more, at least 3 times more than women. So when we look at that, we say, wow, that's a gender issue, right? So it's a problem related to men. No, it's not. It's actually women, we attempt 2 to 3 times more than men. And the reason why women don't die is because of the method again, because a lot of women, they take pills so they are taken to a hospital and they don't die. So it's related to the method, but it's not. So when you look at the numbers, it's not that it's a male issue. It's not. It's equally an issue when it comes to gender. Men just die more because they mostly use guns. So it's more lethal. So age groups, 75 and up, that's the number one. But youth, and when we talk about age group, let me just go back there. we worry a lot about the youth and actually kids. The latest numbers we have, it's really startling that the number of suicide in kids with aged 10 to 14 almost tripled in 10 years. So it's really scary what's happening. And discrimination is a big thing too. So there are some population minorities like LGBTQ population, refugees, prisoners, ex-convicts. So it's higher in this population too. So, okay, so I'm going to talk about one of the ways that we can try to dig into suicide without what I said in the beginning, that narrow view of what was this one event that happened. And I'm going to mention here the case, in this case would be I will use my father as an example, because now when we look back, we see a lot of things that precipitated his suicide. And of course, at the time, we didn't put that together. But 3 years, 3.5 years, for example, before he died, he got divorced and he started a new relationship. Starting a new relationship can be good, but in his case, he started a new relationship with someone who had very young kids. And my father was very much a family man, and he started feeling responsible for these kids. And at the same time, he was having a lot of financial problems. So for him, it was a lot of pressure. So in one way, he had a new partner, which was a good thing, but there was a lot of pressure from the fact that he felt responsible for young kids. So this happened around 3.5 years before his death. And then after that, he became unemployed. He was 65 at the time, because he died at 68. So he became unemployed, and you can imagine at that age, it's really hard to find a new job. So he started a new business with the money that he had put aside and he had saved for his retirement, and the business didn't work. So he started really having financial problems. He was also diagnosed with depression at the time. And I remember I was very worried about him about 1.5 years before he died. And one day we had lunch and I talked to him, and I finally convinced him to go see a doctor. And he did go see a doctor. He was diagnosed with depression, but he was very proud. And for this generation, it was much harder. Today, we have an understanding about depression that's very different from his generation. So it was really hard. Although he did go to the doctor, he never took the medication. He did buy the medication. I remember one time I talked to him, but he never really took the medication. So we can see now that there are many events that precipitated what happened. He started really feeling despondent, and I was very close to my father at the time. I wasn't close to him during all my life, but the last few years of his life I was. And I remember that me and my sisters, we used to talk, and every Sunday we would go see him, and we knew that he wasn't doing well. And I personally tried to help, especially financially, but we didn't really see that it was getting any better until he really became hopeless. And this is not a phase that now we know it happened, but I really didn't see it happen then. I knew that he was feeling very pressured, he was sad, he was depressed, but I believed he was taking the medication. So at the time I didn't see it until in 2005 when he died. Warning signs are very important. I think that's the main thing. If I could really help you understand, one thing would be warning signs, because that's the events. They're very hard to identify as really leading to suicide, because we all have problems, right? And everybody's living their lives, and it's hard to associate that. But the warning signs, especially the ones that I will talk about in the next slide, which are the red flags, you can really notice, and you can help someone And that's the main thing, is being able to identify the signs and maybe help them, someone you know. There are, first of all, the verbal signs. And you can hear someone say things like, I don't see the point, which can lead, can show you that they're already feeling hopeless. And again, that's a main thing in suicide. So they can say things like, I don't get the point of life. I don't see the point anymore. Or they can even be straightforward about it and say things like, I want to die, I feel like dying. I don't see the point of living. And many times we don't pay attention to that because we believe in the myth that when people want to die, they do. That's one of the myths, and I'm going to talk about that too, about suicide. That no, when someone is really intentional and they really want to take their own lives, they will. Nothing can stop them, and that's not true. So really pay attention if someone verbalizes the wish to die, especially teenagers, because that's when we really hear people saying, oh, that's just him getting they want attention. It's a teenage thing, it's a phase. No, it's not. It's not natural for human beings. The most basic instinct we have is survival. So when someone says, I want to die, listen. So that's the first warning sign. The second set of warning signs, they are very similar to depression. So when you look at, if you do any research on depression and symptoms, you will see all of these. So mood swings, they become either agitated, or they'll be happy today, tomorrow they'll be up and down, and they feel a lot of anxiety, and then they're sad, and then they're agitated again. So when you observe that, or aggression or withdrawal from others, teenagers, they'll just stay in their rooms all the time. Substance abuse, they start using drugs, can be alcohol or any kind of drugs. They start either sleeping too much or too little, having difficulty sleeping. No more joy, that's a major one. No more joy from activities. So they stop doing, if they're into sports, they stop doing sports or music or theater, whatever they enjoy, hobbies. So they stop doing that because there's no more joy. They isolate themselves. Again, hopelessness, it's major. That's why it's in orange. They don't take care of appearance anymore. They don't take shower. They stop brushing their hair, their teeth, and you can, their clothes are dirty. So this is something to watch for too. They engage in risky behavior, maybe risky sports or something like that, or self-destructive behavior. They become interested in death. It can be in death-related activities, or it can be music, poetry, but they're very fixated on death-related things. So this is a set of symptoms that you will find are very similar to symptoms of depression, but they can be a warning sign to suicide. So just for you to pay attention and watch out. So apart from verbal signs in depression, now we're going to talk about what I call the red flags, and I'll give you again an example of my father's, because he was textbook suicide red flags. Most of them we experienced that. Some of them we noticed, some we didn't. So when and why are they red flags? They're red flags because it indicates that they're not just thinking about suicide. Because when we talk about suicide, think of a continuum. So you start with thoughts of suicide, which is pretty common. Many people have that. Then it goes into ideation. They can't stop thinking about suicide. Then it can really progress into attempt and then death. So it's a continuum. And that's why these are red flags, because they indicate that the person has advanced to planning the suicide. It's not just ideation. It's not just these thoughts that come to their minds. They really have planned. That's why I call them red flags. So one of them is putting your affairs in order. And that happened to my father a few months before he died. He called me, and as I told you, I was helping him financially. and organize his life. And one day he called me and, oh, can we have lunch? And we had lunch. And he said, you know, I need your documents because I was thinking about opening a joint account. And I said, okay, because at the time I was helping him. I said, oh yeah, that'll make things easier. Okay, so I gave him all my documents. But now when I look back, I realized that was part of his plan already, because he knew, I don't know what it's like here in the US, but in Brazil, if he had an open account with me when he died, then I could do something with this money. I could, you know, give it to my mother or whatever. But in Brazil, if you have an account and you die, it takes years for the family to get a hold of the money. So that was, now I realized that. Of course, at the time I thought it was just because of the financial, you know, discussions that we were having. So that's one of the things, when they start organizing their lives. It can be financially, they pay their debts. And my father did that too. He paid all the debts he had because he didn't want the family to have any problems. Another one is when they start giving away possessions. And even the ones that have sentimental value, that's really a red flag, because they're letting go of everything of value in their lives and emotional value. So that's something too. And with my father, that happened, and it's really, it's something that I only found out a few days ago talking to my sister, because my father was in the army for many, many years, and he had a gun collection. And that was one of the few things that, no matter how many times we moved, he always kept his gun collection. And a few months before he died, he sold his guns to a friend of ours. I didn't know that until the other day talking to my sister, because I was talking to her about these red flags, and she said, yeah, he actually sold all his gun except one. He actually kept one, and he told my friend who bought the guns from him, he told my friends, no, that one is for me. And my friend didn't think anything of it. I didn't know that had happened, but that was a red flag sign that my father really exhibited, and I didn't know. And my friend, of course, after it happened, it's always after, he said, wow, I didn't think, it didn't even cross my mind that that's what he meant. Of course, they start saying goodbyes. My father did that too. And I actually had an experience with a friend of mine, but it was after I had finished my book, and I knew all of this already. And just shows you how you can really help if you know about these warning signs. I had a friend of mine call me once, and I could tell immediately that she was calling to say goodbye. When she called me, I was home and she was in another city. And I asked her directly, I said, why are you thinking about taking your life? Because I could tell when she started crying. She had it all planned for that week. And fortunately, I knew what to do, and I am going to talk about that after this slide. And I took her to the doctor. She's still alive, but she had it all planned. But that is something very, very common, because they know they won't be around and they want to say goodbye to people they love. So they start calling friends they haven't talked to for a long time. They call family members, and they start saying goodbye to these people. But of course, again, no one will think that. It's, oh, they're just calling to catch up because we haven't talked in so long. But my dad did that. And one day before he died, he went to my sister's house. And my sister, this was the only warning sign that she noticed, that we all noticed. She called me the same day and she said there was something off. I think he's thinking about hurting himself. She called me the same night, and I was out of town, and I said, don't worry, when I get there, I'll talk to him. But I didn't have time because he had it all planned for the next day. But my sister noticed that there was something really wrong with him. And another one it's a very common one too, is that they stop talking about the future, and these come together, they start talking about the past. And again, the example of, and that was the moment my sister noticed. that he was saying goodbye was because my father often picked me up at the airport, and she asked him, "Are you going to pick her up this week when she comes back?" And he wouldn't answer. He would go back to the past, and he told her, "Oh, Paul, I remember this trip that we did, and we had so much fun." And my sister insisted, and that's when she realized that there was something wrong, because she kept asking him, "But Dad, are you picking her up?" And he wouldn't answer. So this was something that was very visible, and my sister noticed. So these are the ones that are very common. And the last one, it happens, it's not that common, but it does happen. I'm sure you've heard this. But he or she seemed to be doing much better. I don't understand. She was doing much better. She was working, and then she took her own life. I've heard that a few times, and what happens actually is that they do show improvement. It's not that they're faking it. It's more that they actually, the conflict, the ambivalence of should I do it or not has been resolved. They really decided that they're going to do it. So there's no more conflict. And therefore they do seem, and they feel that there's no more conflict. That so they, apparently it looks like they don't have, they're feeling better. Their moods are different, and those who are around them, they think that they're doing better, they improve it, but it's actually just the fact that they don't have the conflict anymore. So it's very misleading, and it does happen sometimes. So just keep this warning, the red flags in mind. They put their affairs in order, they give away possessions, they say goodbye, they don't talk about future anymore, they become nostalgic, and they seem to be improving. So these are red flags because they're very misleading too. Okay, now the myths about suicide. This is very important to talk about because it's misleading, and it also leads to a lot of the stigma associated with it, and it can stop you from helping someone. So the first one is people who talk about suicide don't really mean it, because if you do want, you will do it. I've discussed this before. It's quite the opposite. Listen, if anyone says that. The second one is suicidal people are crazy or mentally ill. I think I've already covered that too. It's got nothing to do with being crazy, which is a very strong and stigma inducing word too, or mentally ill. No, it just means that they are in pain. That's what suicide is about. That's one thing that we need to keep in mind. Suicide is not a wish to die. It's not, most of the time, it's not that the person wants to die. They want to end pain. That's what suicide is about. They want to end that life. They want to end unbearable pain. That's what suicide is about. It's not about dying. So, and that's why it's preventable, because many times, if you can help them through their pain, and if you can help them find solutions or deal better with their situation, if you offer help, then you can prevent the suicide many times. The other myth is suicidal people want to die. Yeah, I just mentioned that. It's not about dying. It's about, and even if they say, I want to end my life, many times what they're saying is, I want to end the life that I'm having right now. It's the experience, and it's the pain that they're talking about. And the other myth is, when a person wants to die, nothing will stop them. No, there are many ways you can stop someone from dying. Taking away the method from them is one of them that can be very helpful. And the last one, that's a very important one, should be the first actually. If you bring up suicide, it will place the idea in their heads. That's the number one thing that we have to enforce, because it's one of the things behind the stigma. We believe that let's not talk about suicide because then nobody would do it. No, it's usually the opposite. When someone is experiencing this level of pain, Believe me, they want to talk about it. It's just that they either don't have anyone to talk to, or they think that you'll never understand because you're not in their shoes, or because they think they're going to be judged. And that's unfortunately what happens many times. And the stigma really silences people. So these are the main ones. Let's say you have identified that someone, you may even been thinking, oh, wow, maybe this person I know is thinking about suicide, either because you can identify some of the events, or you identify the warning signs. How can you help? This is very important. The first thing is listen without judgment. So what do I mean by that? No right and wrong. Keep in mind that this is a person who is in pain, who is probably feeling very isolated, very alone, and who has very few people who are willing to listen. So if you do listen, don't judge. Don't do that. You're going to hurt your family. This is absolutely, they know they're going to hurt their family. They know they're going to hurt people around them, but they don't see any other option. It's something that in the literature we call constriction, or tunneling vision. It's the only thing you see, that's the only way out. So when you sit down with someone who might be thinking about suicide, really open your heart. It's going to be a very difficult conversation to have, but do not judge. That's the first thing. There is no right and wrong. Just really listen, sit in with their pain, and try to understand where they're coming from. The other thing that you can do to help is try to identify where they are. Are they thinking about suicide? Are they planning suicide? Have they decided or not? Because this is where it can help you understand and decide what your next step will be. So are they thinking, or is there a definite plan? Do they have a date? Do they have access to method? So try to ask these questions, and ask directly. Don't avoid the word suicide. You can use the word. You're not going to put the idea in their heads, as I said before. So you can ask, if you don't feel comfortable using the word suicide, you can ask, are you thinking about taking your life? But ask directly, because chances are they're dying to talk about it. I have never, and this has been my experience, I have talked to dozens of people who have attempted suicide. Because of my website, they talk to me all the time. I would say even more than 100 people. And I've never had a case of someone who was not willing to talk. And it always struck me as very odd that people who didn't know me would contact me through my webpage and just open their hearts and send me like these long emails or letters or whatever. Sometimes they would even find my telephone number. But I always thought, well, for someone, first of all, to be they're researching about suicide, to have found my website. And then they talk to someone they never knew, they never met. I'm a stranger, and they still are opening their hearts. This is someone in pain, and it's someone very isolated and alone. And they are dying to be heard. So just keep that in mind. You can talk openly to them, because chances are they want to. And also I have a podcast, and of course, because of the book and the website and all the work I do, I have interviewed many people. I've never had one person say no. I know through friends that someone attempted, or someone was in crisis and talked about suicide. I've even, and the one thing that always impressed me was, I always ask, can I use your name, or do you want me to use a makeup name? Or they always said, no, please use my name. Please use my name, because I think it's important to help people. I know there are people like me. So they're really willing to share their story. It's just something to keep in mind. Be proactive, and that can show it can be in many ways. You can, for example, in my case with my friend, when she called me, I did call, I asked her, I said, can you give me a few days? I know I respect your decision. I know you're in pain, but can you just give me one chance? Can you go see a doctor? And I did pick her up. I took her to the doctor. She was diagnosed with severe depression, and she started treatment. But you can be proactive by doing that, but maybe taking them to the doctor. It's not always a case of mental illness, as I said, but try to identify what the crisis is. Maybe try to bring some kind of hope to them and broaden their view of what the options are. That's another way to be proactive too. Remove weapons, that's another way. And it's very important. All the research shows that if you remove the weapons, it can be very helpful. Can take them to a mental health professional, help them build a support system. So involve people. Don't do that alone, because it's a heavy thing to do. So ask for their consent. For example, family is a very tricky one, because sometimes that's the source of the crisis. It can be a case of, for example, substance use in the family. It can be abuse in the family. So this is a very tricky one. You should always ask for consent when it comes to involving family members, because although they might want to help, but sometimes they can be the central problem for them. So just try to figure out what the problem is and see ways that you can be proactive and help them and involve more people. Because depending on which stage they are in terms of planning, you might need to do that. Not to leave them alone, for example. And also, suicide hotline is very helpful. They speak many languages. They have, people are very well trained. So this is a number to have at hand too. And it can help a lot, because, and they have text too. So if you go online, you can find the number for texting too. They have for vets, and they have, I think, more than 100 different languages. So the suicide hotline is a great resource to always have. Language is very important too. Things that we should avoid saying, and this is my last slide, I believe. I think I have one more, but language is important. There are things that we should avoid, for example, and this is the most common one. We still use it a lot. We hear that, and it's everywhere. It's commit suicide. Avoid saying that, because as you might well know, because that's your area, we associate the word commit to crime. And suicide is not a crime, so we avoid. Instead of saying that, you can say he died or she died by suicide. So that's one thing to pay attention to. Success, I see that all the time too. Oh, he was successful in killing themselves. There is no success in taking your own life. So one of the words that we use is suicided, which to me, maybe because English is not my first language, it still sounds weird as a verb, but you can use died by suicide too. That's another option. Or failed, if it's not a success, you can't really be considered a failure. It's for the same reason. Avoid both words. He failed, he had a failed attempt. We shouldn't use that. You can use non-fatal attempt. So that's an option. And completed, there's still controversy here, but some people consider that when you say that he completed, it implies success. So he went all the way through and he completed it. You can use ended or he took his own life. So I'll just give you two examples. So he died by suicide instead of committed suicide. And it was a non-fatal suicide attempt instead of saying successful suicide, because it's really no success. So here's what I hope, this is the last slide, is from everything that I just told you and shared with you is I hope that next time you hear the word suicide or you read about it, you don't see it as it is right now in this slide as this isolated event that happened because of one or because of a divorce. Because when we do that, the next question is, who is to blame? And that's one of the things that I want to avoid, and I want to invite you to think about. When we associate suicide to one event, the next question is, who is to blame? So we should avoid that too. So if you, after this presentation, the way I want you to see suicide is this. So instead of isolated, it's just the tip of many, many other factors that contributed to this, to the death. So just to end it, this is my book. I have a podcast, and by the way, I just posted today, this morning, my last